guys, so Latin jazz, as the name implies, is jazz that uses rhythms derived from Latin American music. Now there are two main categories of Latin jazz. Afro-Cuban jazz, which is based off Cuban music, on which I have a separate video, and Afro-Brazilian jazz, which is based off Brazilian music and typically refers to the Bossa Nova. Now before the Bossa Nova, the United States had already been exposed to some Brazilian music in the form of songs like Brazil and Tico Tico. But it was not until the late 1950s and early 1960s, with the creation of Bossa Nova, that the popularity of Brazilian music really took off. And it's basically a fusion of samba and jazz, so using traditional Brazilian rhythms with more harmonically complex jazz harmony and more melodic dissonance. For an example of this melodic dissonance, have a listen to Jobim's classic Desafinado, which translated into English literally means out of tune. Now the most important Bossa Nova composer is Antonio Jobim, while the most important musician is the singer and guitarist João Gilberto. Now the Bossa Nova was largely a Brazilian trend until about 1960, when jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie, Stan Getz and Charlie Byrd discovered Jobim's songs and began performing them, thus introducing the US to Bossa Nova. From there it spread quickly and became a massive craze in the US. Of course, it also helped that the Cuban Revolution of 1959 made celebrating Cuban things a little bit taboo in the US. So then, if musicians wanted to insert some Latin influence into their music, but still stay politically correct, they had to get their Latin rhythms from somewhere else. Now stylistically, Bossa Nova is soft, sparse and gentle. It sways rather than swings. It's quite restrained in the sense that it uses little vibrato or dynamic variation. In jazz lingo, it's cool rather than hot. But the melodies and lyrics can still be quite emotional and melancholy and touching. So the most important aspect of all Latin American music is the rhythm. The rhythm is what differentiates it from other genres or subgenres of jazz. Now in Afro-Cuban music, the most important rhythm is the clave rhythm, which goes 1, 2 and 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2 and 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The clave is the rhythm around which an entire song is structured. On top of this bass clave rhythm, every instrument is allocated a very specific rhythmic pattern that they play through the entire song with little to no variation. The piano, for example, often plays a tumbao rhythm in the left hand and a montuno in the right hand. And together this creates a really strong driving rhythm that feels like it's moving forward. Now Afro-Brazilian music, on the other hand, does not have a clave. There is no central foundational rhythm around which all the other rhythms are structured. All rhythms in bossa novas can be varied or interchanged or substituted. Having said that, because musicians like rules, there is a particular rhythm that is widely used in bossa novas that has been called the Brazilian clave or the Bossa Nova clave. It's very similar to the Cuban clave, but delays the second note of the 2-bar by half a beat. And this rhythm is often played by the drummer in a bossa nova. And it goes as follows. 1, 2 and 3, 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4, 1, 2 and 3, 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4. But just to reiterate, while this rhythm is quite widely used, it is not a clave rhythm. That is, it is not a central organizing principle around which all the other rhythms are structured. It's more of a rhythmic motif rather than a true clave. This rhythm is more of a guideline rather than a rule or a requirement in bossa nova. It can be varied or substituted. So it is not an iron law. Again, Brazilian music does not have a clave. And partly for this reason, it sounds much more relaxed and a bit more sort of subdued when compared to Cuban music. So when playing a bossa nova, we can divide the song up into 3 parts, each of which has a particular rhythm. And these are a bossa nova bass ostinato pattern, a bossa nova chordal comping pattern, and the melody. Now, bossa novas are played with straight eighth notes, but are highly syncopated, which gives them a bit of a swaying feeling. So let's now tackle each one of these 3 parts individually and then gradually combine them. And as our example, we'll be taking the jazz standard Girl from Ipanema. So if we were to play the melody and the chords of this song without worrying about inserting any kind of Latin rhythm, we could play something like this. Okay, so that's fine, but now let's start inserting some bossa nova rhythms to make this more in keeping with that style. So first let's look at the left hand rhythm. Now this goes 1, 2 and 3, 4 and 1, 2 and 3, 4 and 1, 2 and 3, 4 and so on. And typically you want to land on the root of the chord on beat 1 and the 5th of the chord on beat 3 of each bar. And the little eighth notes before beats 1 and 3 can either repeat the note or anticipate the next note or jump octaves or act as a kind of chromatic approach note. Those little eighth notes don't really matter as much because they're quite short and off the beat. They can more or less be anything you want them to be because they're not really harmonically important, though they are rhythmically important. So looking at the first chord of Girl from Ipanema, we have an F major 7, so the root is an F and the 5th is a C. So we're going to be alternating between those 2 notes. And using this pattern, we could play a number of different bass lines, for example, this. So that's repeating the note, or we could anticipate the next note by doing something like this. Or we could jump octaves, for example, by doing something like this. Or you could add those little chromatic approach notes, for example. And you are allowed to vary the rhythm a tiny bit here or there just to make it more interesting, but not too much, as you do want to keep this general rhythmic framework and feel going. But if you do vary it in one bar, just fall back to the standard left hand bossa bass ostinato pattern in the next bar. So using this idea, we could play section A of Girl from Ipanema as follows. So I was literally just hitting the root and the 5th of each chord using that standard bossa left hand rhythm and just putting a little kind of approach notes or varying the rhythm very, very slightly, but more or less keeping it going pretty evenly all the way through. Next, let's talk about the chords, which we're going to play with our right hand. Now, because your left hand is already playing the root on beat 1 of every bar, we don't need to repeat it in our right hand. So we're just going to use rootless voicings in our right hand. Now, I have a separate video on rootless voicings if you don't know what these are, so you can go watch that. But they're pretty self-explanatory. They're chord voicings that don't include the root. Now, there is no single chordal rhythmic pattern that you have to adhere to when comping over a bossa nova. Every song has its own comping patterns and it changes throughout the song. So unlike Afro-Cuban songs, where the chords tend to adhere to a fixed rhythmic pattern all the way through the song, bossa novas are a bit more fluid and organic and flexible, as it varies over time and doesn't adhere to a rigid formula. The only requirement for bossa nova is that your comping is syncopated. So you have to, at the very least, use 1 or 2 offbeats. Now, there are literally scores of different bossa comping patterns, so I can't go through all of them here. You can just Google them. I have, however, put a few common ones up here in the picture-in-picture. And a particularly widely used one goes as follows. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4. So now we can combine the bass ostinato with our rootless chord comping to get something that sounds much more like a bossa nova. Right, so that was literally just left hand bass pattern with a on and off the beat comping of rootless chord voicings in my right hand. Cool, now finally we can now add the melody on top of all of this. So the melody is, of course, the most important part of the song. Bossa nova melodies are often quite rhythmically interesting and, again, use syncopation. So the melody should be played louder and higher than the chords. And you can interpret it with a certain amount of, or a certain degree of rhythmic freedom. You don't have to play it exactly as written. Just make sure it's syncopated. Now, to begin with, just learn the melody by itself. Then learn to play the melody with the left hand bass ostinato. Now, of course, this might take a little bit of practice to get your hand independence up because we are using lots of syncopated rhythms. And now, finally, we also want to add in the chords. But we can't use rootless chord voicings anymore, as this requires too many fingers, and we need to leave some fingers free to play the actual melody. So we're just going to use shell chords of just 2 chords with our bottom fingers on our right hand. And ideally we want to hit the 3rd and the 7th, so the guide tones, of each chord when comping, as our left hand is already playing the root and the 5th. But if the 3rd and the 7th are too hard to reach, too far apart, then you can just play the 3rd and the 5th instead. So doing this, we can now play Girl from Ipanema as follows. see, we now have the bass ostinato at the bottom, the chords in the middle, and the melody at the top, all going at the same time. So for example, the first couple bars, I'm on the bass ostinato here, and so I'm playing the third and the fifth simultaneously, as well as the melody at the top. Then I go to the G, to the G7, so I'm playing the 7th and the 3rd and the melody on top. To the G minor 7, so I hit the 7th and the 3rd again. To the G flat 7, so 7th and the 3rd, with the melody on top. Cool. And when improvising, I take a very similar approach. The left hand continues playing the bass ostinato, and the right hand alternates between playing a little improvised phrase and comping the chords. Cool, and that's it for me. Thanks again for watching, guys, and see you next time. Bye.